You may know Depeche Mode because of these songs. They marked entire generations and turned a group of English boys into one of the greatest electronic bands of all time. But there's one part of this story that nostalgia cannot explain. Behind the scenes, the band faced addictions, emotional crises, a chaotic tour, the departure of important members, and moments when death stopped being just a theme in their music and became a real threat. Dave Gahan nearly lost his life several times. Martin Gore struggled with alcohol. Andy Fletcher went through severe emotional exhaustion. And Alan Wilder was carrying the weight of the band's technical and creative overload. And even so, Depeche Mode kept going. Today, we're going to understand how a band from a grey town in England became a worldwide phenomenon, and why their journey is one of the most intense, dark, and human stories in music. The story of Depeche Mode begins in Basildon, a working-class town in Essex, far from the glamour of London and the major music scenes of the time. It was an ordinary, gray, and limited space. But for young people like Vince Clarke and Andrew Fletcher, music seemed like a way out. In the late 1970s, driven by the spirit of punk, they understood one simple thing. You did not need to be a great musician to start a band. You just needed the desire to do it. In 1977, they created No Romance in China. It was a simple project with no money, no structure, and not much technique. But Vince soon began paying attention to synthesizers. They were modern, practical, and could create almost anything. Beats, bass lines, melodies, and entire atmospheres. That was when Martin Gore came into the picture. He was one of the few young people in town who had a synthesizer and played keyboards and guitar, and that caught Vince and Fletcher's attention. They realized that this instrument could change everything. From that point on, Martin joined the project, and they renamed it Composition of Sound. By then, the band had become fully electronic. To many people, they did not even seem like a real band, but it was that very difference that would pave the way for Depeche Mode. They just needed to find the right voice. And it came in 1980 with Dave Gahan. Until then, Vince had been singing, but Dave brought attitude and a stage presence the band still did not have. Dave had a difficult story. He was abandoned by his biological father when he was still a baby, grew up believing his stepfather was his real father, and, as a teenager, became a rebellious young man, involved in minor offenses and nights marked by drinking. But that troubled life also gave him a different kind of intensity. Dave did not seem like a manufactured pop singer. He seemed like someone real. Vince heard him singing David Bowie's Heroes at an informal gathering of local musicians and realized that voice could complete the group. But beyond the voice, Dave also brought the band's definitive name. While studying fashion and window dressing, he was flipping through a French magazine called Depeche Mode. The expression could be associated with something like fast fashion or fashion news. For an English band, a French name made them sound sophisticated and slightly strange at the same time. With that, the original lineup was complete. Dave Gahan, Martin Gore, Andy Fletcher, and Vince Clarke. And then Depeche Mode grew too fast. After drawing attention in London clubs, the band signed with Daniel Miller's Mute Records. In 1981, they released Dreaming of Me, then New Life. But it was with Just Can't Get Enough that the band truly broke through in the United Kingdom. The song captured the sound of that first phrase. Cheerful synthesizers, a danceable beat, and a catchy chorus. The debut album, Speak and Spell, followed that same spirit. Light, youthful, accessible electronic pop. At that moment, Depeche Mode seemed to have found its path, but that path depended heavily on Vince. He was the band's main songwriter and had written almost the entire first album. So when Vince left the group shortly after that initial success, many people thought the story would end there. Vince moved on and would find success with Yazoo and Erasure. Within Depeche Mode, Martin Gore took over the songwriting, and it was precisely this that led the band into deeper territory. The lyrics began to speak about guilt, faith, desire, power, and suffering. The sound also started becoming less colorful and more dense. Only one piece was still missing for this new phase to take shape on stage and in the studio, and that piece would be Alan Wilder. To replace Vince, the band placed an ad looking for a young keyboardist. The person who showed up was Alan. While Dave, Martin, and Fletch had a more instinctive, almost family-like relationship, Alan was disciplined and technically minded, with studio experience and a more sophisticated approach to production. At first, he seemed like almost a stranger within the band, but his arrival would change everything. The first album released after Vince's departure was A Broken Frame in 1982. There was still something of the early synth-pop sound, but songs like See You and Leave in Silence already pointed toward a more melancholic Depeche Mode. That shift fully took shape on Construction Time Again, released in 1983, Some Great Reward in 1984, and Black Celebration in 1986. These albums brought the singles Everything Counts, People Are People, and Stripped.
Everything counts in large amounts. People are people, so why should it be? Let me see you stripped down.
In 1987, with Music for the Masses, Depeche Mode took another leap forward. Strangelove, Behind the Wheel, and Never Let Me Down Again were still electronic, but on a much bigger, more anthemic scale. The Music for the Masses tour marked the moment Depeche Mode truly reached the biggest stages. That became undeniable in 1988 at the Rose Bowl in California, when more than 60,000 people packed the stadium to see a synth-pop band command the stage like an arena rock band. The concert was captured in the documentary 101 by D.A. Pennebaker and Chris Hegedus, and showed something many people still doubted. Synthesizers could also create stadium anthems. Even so, Depeche Mode still existed somewhere in between, too big to be underground, but too dark to be simply pop. In 1990, Depeche Mode reached its peak with Violator. The album mixed electronic music, rock, blues, hip-hop, and dance music with precision. Personal Jesus brought a striking guitar riff, and Enjoy the Silence turned melancholy into one of the band's biggest hits. In 1993, Songs of Faith and Devotion was released. The title spoke of faith and devotion, but the mood was something else: guilt, desire, pain, and despair. Musically, the album marked a turning point. Guitars became more prominent. Live drums brought more weight to the songs, and gospel, grunge, and alternative rock began to enter the band's sound. Depeche Mode seemed to be trying to reinvent itself in a world dominated by 1990s rock. Dave Gahan had also changed. Living in Los Angeles, he adopted long hair, a beard, and tattoos. For many fans, it just seemed like a new visual phase. But it went deeper than that. Dave was sinking into heroin addiction and an increasingly dangerous lifestyle. The recording sessions were tense. Dave struggled to record his vocals. Alan Wilder had to rebuild songs from small fragments of his voice. Martin Gore was also dealing with his own excesses, and Andy Fletcher was facing emotional problems. And this collapse would not stay hidden in the studio. On the tour that followed, it would spill onto the road, onto the stage, and into full view of the audience. All the details about the most debauched rock and roll tour of all time are coming up now. The Devotional Tour began in May 1993 in France and lasted around 18 months. It was a massive production with a huge crew, backing singers, and an elaborate stage setup designed to make the songs feel almost religious. For the audience, it was hypnotic. lights, drama, and Dave Gahan completely absorbed in the performance. With its success in Europe, the tour was extended and, in 1994, renamed the Exotic Tour. The idea was to take Depeche Mode to places where the band had never performed before, including Latin America. In Brazil, they played at the Olympia concert venue. In Argentina, they performed for a massive crowd at Vélez Sarsfield Stadium in Buenos Aires. In Chile, they made a historic debut at the Velodrome of the National Stadium in Santiago, a concert that, years later, the musicians themselves would remember as one of the best of that tour. The tour also made stops in San Jose, Costa Rica, and Monterrey, Mexico. The Devotional Tour went down as one of the most chaotic tours in rock history. Q magazine would later call it the most debauched rock and roll tour ever, a description repeated by The Guardian and The Washington Post. And it wasn't just media hype. The tour was marked by drugs, alcohol, parties, trashed hotel rooms, and a pace that seemed impossible to sustain. Dave Gahan traveled in isolation. He would often stay alone in dark hotel rooms, surrounded by candles and symbols that reinforced an almost mystical image, as if he were turning into the dark character the audience saw on stage. The band even hired a psychiatrist to accompany the tour. In Cincinnati, another show was canceled after Dave injured his hand while opening a beer bottle, leaving him unable to hold the microphone. But the most serious episode happened in New Orleans in October 1993, when Dave suffered a drug-related heart attack during a performance and had to be taken away on a stretcher. The tour ended in July 1994 in Indianapolis. Even at the final show, chaos was still present. At the end of the performance, Dave jumped toward the audience, but ended up falling from a considerable height onto the seats. He had to be taken to the hospital and would later discover that he had suffered broken ribs and internal bleeding. The exhausting Devotional Tour, with almost 200 shows, was not just an excursion to promote an album. It was the moment when all the tensions that had been building since Violator finally erupted. Andy Fletcher would later say that that period between recording and touring was almost the worst years of their lives. And when the dust settled, it became clear that nothing would ever be the same again. Before we continue, consider becoming a member of Suggest. As a member, you get access to exclusive perks, help the channel produce more documentaries, invest even more in quality, and bring member-only projects to life. And all of that for a very affordable price. Support Suggest and be part of this next chapter of the channel. The Devotional Tour left lasting scars on Depeche Mode. The first major rupture came in 1995, when Alan Wilder left the band. He pointed to his dissatisfaction with the atmosphere within the band and the unequal division of the workload. For many fans, it was like losing an invisible part of the group. Alan was not the face of the band like Dave, nor the main songwriter like Martin, but he helped shape the sound of essential albums, such as Music for the Masses, Violator, and Songs of Faith and Devotion. But Alan's departure was only one part of the problem. Dave Gahan was living through the most dangerous period of his life. His heroin addiction was no longer just part of the backstage chaos. It had become a real threat to his life. Without the band's routine to occupy his mind, he sank deeper and deeper into addiction. In 1995, he tried to take his own life. The following year, he had suffered an overdose involving heroin and cocaine. His heart stopped, and he went through a near-death experience. Years later, when speaking about that moment to The Guardian, Dave described absolute darkness and a feeling of terror, as if he had realized he did not have the control over his own life that he thought he had. After so many close calls with death, paramedics began calling him the Cat. From that moment on, the story was no longer just about a band in crisis. It became a story of survival. Dave went to rehab, and this time managed to stay away from drugs. Martin Gore was also carrying his own battle with alcohol. This made Dave's recovery even harder. After the overdose and rehab, he was trying to stay sober, but Martin continued drinking for years. Martin himself would later acknowledge it was difficult at the time. And I think that must have been really hard for Dave because, I wasn't an occasional drinker, and that was in Dave's face all the time. Andrew Fletcher also reached his breaking point. The tensions within the band, more than a year spent almost constantly on the road, and the death of his sister from stomach cancer deepened his struggles with anxiety. At one point, he had to check himself into a hospital in England. Years later, looking back on that period with the benefit of hindsight, he summed it up. It's so long ago, and we were very different people then. It was a small period of our lives, but we got over it. And, against all expectations, Depeche Mode returned. In 1997, they released Ultra, which includes the singles Barrel of a Gun and It's No Good.
I'm not the one. Don't say you want me. Don't say you.
Without Alan Wilder, the band had to find a new way forward. The album had a denser, slower atmosphere, shaped by influences from trip-hop and electric rock. In 1998, Depeche Mode returned to the stage with the Singles 86 to 98 tour, 64 concerts in 18 countries for more than 1 million fans. But this time, there was a difference. After the tour, each member took some time to step back. That pause was important. After everything that had happened, Depeche Mode could no longer work the way they had before. The members had learned the hard way that their bodies and minds had limits. In the following years, the group returned with a new sense of caution. In 2001, they released Exciter with Dream On and I Feel Love.
Dream on, dream on, feel love.
Then came Playing the Angel in 2005 with songs like Precious and John the Revelator.
These get savage, these get shouted, John the Revelator.
Later, in 2009, Sounds of the Universe featured singles such as Wrong and Peace.
Round me blind, wrong, peace, peace.
But even in this more stable phase, the challenges continued. During the tour of the universe, Dave discovered a malignant tumor in his bladder. He underwent surgery, and several performances had to be canceled or postponed. And it did not stop there. After returning to the stage, he suffered a calf injury during a festival in Bilbao, Spain. Shortly afterward, problems with his vocal cords forced the band to cancel shows in California so Dave could rest his voice. In 2013, Depeche Mode released Delta Machine, closing the trilogy produced by Ben Hillier. The album proved that the band still had chart power, reaching number 2 in the United Kingdom and number 6 on the Billboard 200.
There's only one way to soothe my soul.
4 years later, in 2017, Depeche Mode returned with Spirit. The album carried a more political, disillusioned tone, reflecting a world in crisis. Where's the Revolution became the clearest expression of that phrase, a direct question about apathy, power, and social tension. The Spirit Tour was one of the biggest in the band's history and kept the group on the road until 2018. And 2020 brought the crowning moment, their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In their speech, Dave, Martin, and Andrew thanked Vince Clarke and Alan Wilder, acknowledging that Depeche Mode's story would not have been the same without them. After everything, Depeche Mode seemed to have made it through the worst. But not long after, the band would face a loss that would change them forever: the death of Andrew Fletcher. After so many fractures, excesses, and comebacks, it seemed as if Depeche Mode had learned to survive almost anything. But in May 2022, the band lost Andrew Fletcher. Fletcher died at 60, at home, after suffering an aortic dissection. To the public, it was the loss of Depeche Mode's founding members. To Dave Gahan and Martin Gore, it was something even deeper: the absence of a friend who had been there from the beginning, since Basildon, since the first synthesizers, since everything was still too small to seem like history. In 2023, Depeche Mode began a new chapter with Memento Mori. The title, in Latin, means "Remember that you must die." The songs began to be written before Fletcher's death, but were recorded afterward. Because of that, the album took on an emotional weight no one could have predicted. Suddenly, those songs about death, time and farewell were no longer just reflections. They had become reality. But Memento Mori did not sound like the end of Depeche Mode. Even without Fletcher, Dave and Martin moved forward. After the album, there was the tour, the film Depeche Mode M, the live recording Memento Mori Mexico City, and even previously unreleased tracks from the album sessions. In other words, so far, no new studio album has been announced. But there is also no full stop in Depeche Mode's story. If you enjoyed today's video, leave a like and subscribe. Also, leave a comment with suggestions. Very soon, I'll be back with another great story from the world of music.